All right, let's unpack this. Today, we are tackling a subject that is, it's absolutely fundamental to your daily life. It underpins your healthcare, your economy, your security,
It's everywhere.
everywhere. Yet its very definition is a source of intense academic conflict. In fact, one of its defining figures suggested that trying to pin it down in a single sentence causes what he termed mental paralysis.
Which is a fantastic phrase.
It really is. So we are diving deep into the foundations of public administration, or PA, what it means, why it's so hard to define, and exactly where its boundaries lie in the modern multi-actor state.
And this is a really crucial deep dive. If you're trying to get a handle on this topic quickly, you have to understand that PA is inherently dynamic.
Hmm.
So the mission today, it's not just to list off definitions.
Right.
It's to get into the intellectual tensions that created them. We're going to trace the specific schools of thought, the narrow, the broad, the legal, and the economic, and explain why PA had to become what one scholar called a polyglot discipline, just to keep up.
A polyglot discipline. I like
Yeah.
that.
It had to, just to keep up with the changing role of government in the 20th and now the 21st centuries.
We have a comprehensive stack of sources that demonstrate precisely why PA can never have a fixed definition. It is constantly evolving alongside the role of the state itself. So let's jump in by first addressing the foundational dilemma.
The big problem.
The big problem. So we start where all good deep dives start. The problem. If this field, the actual management of government, is so essential, why is it so notoriously hard to pin down? Why the, quote, mental paralysis?
Well, the difficulty really stems from the dynamic nature of the environment it studies. It's a moving target. If you tried to create a stable definition of administration in, say, 1900, it would have been focused on a pretty minimal state.
What, like policing, military, diplomacy?
Maybe the postal service, right. But then the role of the state changed dramatically. You have the Great Depression, 2 world wars, the rise of the welfare state.
Suddenly the government's in everything.
It's responsible for employment, social security, environmental protection, complex scientific research. The whole game changed.
So if your definition relies on static boundaries, if you define administration as just the job of a small 19th century state, it becomes outdated overnight when the state has to, regulate space travel or manage a global pandemic response.
Exactly. Our source material really emphasizes that PA is dynamic because the operating environment is dynamic. This inherent fluidity is why there is no single, fixed, unanimous definition of public administration accepted by all scholars globally.
It's defined by its to-do list, and that list is always changing.
That's a great way to put it. The subject is defined by the very responsibilities it takes on, and those responsibilities are always expanding and contracting.
Okay, so to grapple with this, we have to recognize that we aren't talking about one thing, but two related dimensions that often get confused.
Yes, the practice and the discipline.
Let's start with the practice.
Absolutely. The first dimension, PA as an activity, is the most visible and concrete one. We can think of this as the practice or the profession.
This is the stuff you can see, the tangible output. It's the police officer on patrol, the garbage being collected, the bureaucratic process required to issue a passport.
Or the procurement team buying vaccines. It's the daily reality of government in action. It's what you experience.
And that is crucial, but as you said, it's insufficient. The second dimension is PA as a discipline.
This is the academic side. It's more abstract, more theoretical. It's the study, the analysis, and the philosophy that attempts to understand and improve the practice. It asks the why questions.
So why is the garbage collection structured this way? Or how do we measure efficiency versus equity in the police force?
Or what are the ethical responsibilities when you're administering a really complex social policy? Those are the disciplines questions.
It sounds a bit like the difference between seeing a car drive by, which is the activity, and then studying mechanical engineering to understand how the internal combustion engine actually works. That's the discipline.
That's a perfect analogy. It really is. Understanding PA as a practice, seeing the road paved, is immediate. You get it. Understanding it as a discipline, studying the competing theories of optimal contract management, resource allocation, and budget design for that road project, that requires specialized knowledge. The discipline seeks to give the practitioner the tools to perform the activity better.
Okay, now that we have that distinction, let's go back to the origins. Let's anchor this conversation with the original intent, the etymology.
The etymology is surprisingly clear about the intent, which is refreshing. The word administration comes from the Latin roots ad and ministrare.
Which means?
It translates beautifully to serve or to care for people. And the word public is clearly defined in our sources by a figure we'll talk a lot about, Dwight Waldo, as referring specifically to the state or government.
So the core definition, just the literal meaning of the words, is simply the efforts taken by the government to serve the people. That feels like a stable moral and functional anchor, even if the methods change.
It does, but that moral anchor of service is precisely what became so complicated in the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
And this leads us right to Dwight Waldo, whom you mentioned. We really need to spend some time on him because he fundamentally reshaped how the discipline saw itself.
Waldo wasn't just a scholar, he was a catalyst. I mean, our sources point to the Minnowbrook conferences he organized in 1968 and 1988 as being these huge turning points.
Oh, absolutely. The 1968 Meadowbrook Conference was arguably the most significant. See, up until that point, the prevailing notion, the sort of Wilsonian ideal, was that administration should be a value-neutral science.
Just about efficiency and economy.
Exactly, totally
Yeah.
divorced from politics. But the 1960s were a time of, intense social and political upheaval. You had the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
pervasive social inequalities.
And the younger generation of scholars, they looked at this classical, efficiency-obsessed PA discipline and basically asked, where is the relevance? What are you doing about the real world?
Precisely. Waldo provided the platform for the rise of what became known as the New Public Administration, or NPA. And the movement argued that PA must be normative.
Meaning, it has to be concerned with values, with
Oh.
social equity.
Yes, it couldn't just efficiently implement racist laws. It had an ethical obligation to promote justice and change systems. Minnowbrook forced scholars to acknowledge that the traditional focus on organizational charts and neutral management was just no longer adequate.
So Waldo sets the stage for acknowledging that the environment changes, and critically, the theories have to change too. They have to accommodate ethical demands and social justice, not just efficiency. And that dramatically changed the scope of what counted as administration.
It really did. And once the discipline began to formally study itself, the first intellectual battleground wasn't even about ethics. It was about geometry. Where did the boundaries begin and end? There's no single unanimous definition, right? So the first major debate centered on which parts of the government even count as administration.
Okay, this brings us to the narrow view versus the broad view. Let's start with narrow. It sounds like it simplifies the process by restricting the definition to just one segment of the state.
That's exactly what it does. The narrow view is the strict executive focus. Proponents like Luther Gulick, Simon, Gladden, they restricted PA solely to the executive branch.
The machinery that actually enforces the law?
The machinery responsible for translating laws into action. Their focus was strictly on government inaction, which they saw as technical implementation.
This sounds incredibly neat on paper. They're trying to uphold that classic politics-administration dichotomy, right? Politics is the decision-making in the legislature.
And administration is the purely non-political, technical doing in the executive branch.
A clean separation.
That's the goal. This view seeks efficiency by separating the political policy creation from what they hoped would be, neutral implementation. If you are strictly implementing a legislative mandate, say, managing a budget or directing personnel, you don't, in theory, have to worry about the law's moral or political implications.
You just execute it.
You just need to execute it efficiently and economically.
But history shows that administration and politics rarely separate so cleanly. I mean, if administrators are providing specialized knowledge to help draft the law in the first place, they're already involved in politics.
They're neck deep in it.
And that failure of the dichotomy led to the broad view.
The broad view rejected that clean separation, arguing that governance is an interconnected ecosystem. Proponents like Woodrow Wilson, actually, and Negro, argue that PA covers all three branches: executive, legislature, and judiciary.
All three.
And crucially, how they interact and influence one another.
So even Woodrow Wilson, whose early essay, The Study of Administration, is often credited with launching the field, he recognized that administration begins long before a law is enforced. It involves the entire process.
You did. He saw the whole picture.
Can you give us an example of how the judiciary falls into this broad definition that seems less intuitive?
Certainly. Think about administrative courts or tribunals. These are often housed within the executive structure, but they perform quasi-judicial functions. They adjudicate disputes over things like workers' comp claims or zoning permits.
So they're acting like courts, but they're not technically courts.
Right. And furthermore, the modern judiciary, through its rulings, is constantly defining the boundaries of administrative action. It's determining whether the state's policies are being administered legally. That process of legal application is a form of administration. If you exclude the judiciary, you exclude a huge part of how government actually controls and defines its own policy.
So we've gone from just implementation to the entire integrated system of governance. But even that wasn't broad enough for the political scientists who came next.
That's the critical turning point. Just when you think you've settled the debate between 2 and 3 branches, the political school of thought comes along and challenges the very idea that PA is contained within the bureaucratic state at all.
This is where we bring in that massive knowledge nugget from Robert Dahl and David Easton.
Absolutely. They challenge both the narrow and the broad organizational views. Their core concept defined PA not by organizational structure, but by its political function. They saw PA as the authoritative allocation of values.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to unpacking that phrase. Authoritative allocation of values. What does that truly mean for you, the listener?
It means making decisions, backed by the legitimate power of the state regarding who gets what. Simple as that. Resources, opportunities, restrictions, rights, these are all what they would call values.
Okay, an example.
When a zoning administrator decides where a new factory can be built, that's an authoritative allocation of the value of land use. When the government decides which citizens qualify for a federal grant, that is an authoritative allocation of financial value.
So every administrative decision, no matter how small or how seemingly technical, it involves a political choice about distributive justice, about who gets what.
Precisely. And if the job of PA is to decide who gets what, then the scope just explodes. This school recognizes that PA is not limited just to the state bureaucracy itself. It extends to decision-making, providing goods and services, and ensuring security, even when it involves non-state institutions.
Or even when it involves confronting anti-state elements.
That's a key part of it. For instance, if the government contracts with a massive private tech firm to manage the national healthcare enrollment system, that private tech firm is now involved in the authoritative allocation of values on behalf of the state.
It's acting as an arm of the state.
Yes, and administration even includes the state's response to anti-state actors, like insurgents or powerful criminal organizations. The entire governmental machinery deployed to counter them, intelligence gathering, resource allocation, policy formation, is part of public administration, even though the entity being administered to or against is outside the traditional bureaucratic structure. This view solidified PA's inherently political nature, and, really, it set the stage for its multidisciplinary identity.
So, having struggled to define PA by its organizational boundaries, the branch's scholars next turn to defining it by its purpose or its methodology.
Exactly. What is it for, or how does it work?
Let's start with purpose,
Yeah.
beginning with the highly influential legalistic view.
This is the idea, and it was strongly supported by early scholars like Woodrow Wilson and L.D. White, that PA is strictly the enforcement of law. That's it. The administrator is essentially a legal agent, acting only within the lines drawn by statutes. It seeks to impose order and predictability.
It sounds like the perfect system of accountability, right? The administrator have no power beyond what the law explicitly grants, but our sources offer a sharp critique. They call this view too limited for the reality of modern governance. Why?
Because it's an idealized fantasy, really. In reality, administration involves far more than just executing a statute. It involves policy formation. Administrators often draft the regulations and the guidelines that give the law its teeth.
So they're blurring the line between execution and creation.
They have to. And crucially, it involves administrative discretion.
That's a key term, administrative discretion.
It refers to the informal, often vital decisions that officials must make when a law is vague, or when applying a rigid rule would lead to an absurd or unjust outcome. The law can't possibly account for every specific case. If PA were only law enforcement, a manager would have no job outside of reading statutes. They couldn't adapt to local circumstances or changing needs, which is essential for actual service delivery.
Okay, so moving from the strict definition of law to the strict definition of good, we have the public weal or the welfare view. This seems highly idealistic, defining PA strictly by activities that bring welfare or good to the people.
And while it's seemingly broad and certainly noble, I mean, it links PA right back to its etymology, to serve, this view is criticized for being morally selective.
And intellectually unsound as a definition.
As a definition, yes. The reason is simple. If a definition of administration is going to be intellectually honest, it has to describe the means of state action, regardless of whether the ends are beneficial or harmful.
So if the government initiates a program that results in, say, mass surveillance or forced displacement, those actions are still technically administration,
Of course they are.
even though they are clearly detrimental to public welfare.
Exactly. Our sources explicitly highlight that the government performs actions that are not welfare-oriented. Activities like oppression, subversion, aggressive enforcement of tax policies against marginalized groups, or even war, are still administered actions taken by the state. A definition of PA must be morally neutral to be intellectually robust. It has to encompass the full spectrum of state action, the good and the bad.
Okay, so when purpose fails to provide a stable definition, scholars turn to methodology. This leads us to the process view, the heart of the classical school. This sought universality.
This is one of the oldest and, for decades, one of the most dominant views. It sees PA as a study of tools and techniques, the managerial processes required to get anything done, regardless of the mission or the purpose.
And this leads us directly to that bedrock concept of the classical school, POSDCORB.
Ah, yes, POSDCORB. This is a term every student of administration has to master. It was popularized by Gulick and Erwick, and POSDCOB is an acronym. It represents the 7 steps they believed were universal to all administration.
Let's list them out. P is for
Planning. O for organizing. S for staffing. D for directing. C for coordinating. R for reporting. And B for budgeting.
The revolutionary appeal here was its claim of universal applicability. The proponents believed these techniques were the same, whether you were organizing an army, managing the Treasury Department, or running a bottling plant. It didn't matter.
The underlying philosophy was that management is a science, and these 7 steps are the periodic table of that science. If you know how to organize and how to budget, the content, whether it's national defense or garbage disposal, doesn't change the fundamental process.
Like saying the steps to build a shed are the same whether you're building a private home or government office. But is that really true?
Well, this is where the critique comes in. The critique was devastating. Let's just look at 2 letters in POSDCCORB, O for organizing and S for staffing. In the private sector, organizing focuses almost exclusively on maximizing efficiency and profit. In the public sector, organization has to comply with legislative mandates, constitutional requirements, political accountability to all sorts of stakeholders, and complex civil service laws. The structure is inherently constrained by democratic values, not just economic efficiency.
And staffing is completely different. A private CEO can hire and fire pretty quickly, based purely on performance.
Try doing that in government. Public sector staffing is bound by complex legal frameworks designed to ensure fairness, to prevent political patronage, and to guarantee due process. You have civil service rules, diversity mandates, union agreements. The process of hiring, managing, and firing personnel is fundamentally political and legal in the public sphere.
So that makes the universal technique idea highly suspect when you try to apply it to government.
Extremely suspect. So, while POSDCORB was an excellent framework for identifying necessary functions, its insistence on universality was its ultimate downfall when scholars realized the unique political, legal, and social context of government work.
And the failure of that strict process view, with its universal tools, led naturally to the ascendancy of the subject matter view.
Or the content view, right?
The argument here is simple, yet it's profoundly important. Just knowing how to perform the steps of POSDCORB isn't enough. You absolutely must understand the subject, the content that you are administering.
Because the content dictates everything. It dictates the constraints, the expertise you need, and the required accountability.
This is the crucial pivot that fully establishes PA's multidisciplinary nature, or, as Waldo put it later, its polyglot identity.
The necessary knowledge base shifts entirely depending on the policy area. It becomes a polyglot, a speaker of many languages.
Let's use the example from our sources, which is great. Managing a covert spy agency like RAW or the CIA versus managing a rural development agency. The contrast is stark.
I mean, they couldn't be more different. They require completely different organizational cultures. A rural development agency, it prioritizes transparency, strict financial auditing, that's the B, from POSDCO, open public consultation, and expertise in agricultural economics or sociology.
Accountability is everything. Every dollar has to be tracked and reported publicly.
Exactly. In contrast, a covert intelligence agency minimizes transparency, uses highly specialized non-public financing mechanisms, and relies on expertise in intelligence analysis, counterterrorism, and operational security. Accountability is totally different.
It's internal. It's restricted legislative committees, not public reports.
Right. And crucially, the P for planning element is also vastly different. Planning rural development is long-term and consultative. Planning a covert operation has to be immediate, highly sensitive, and focused on tactical secrecy. The fundamental subject matter dictates everything about the administrative process.
From the personnel skills to the political oversight structure.
Everything. The implication, then, is that PA cannot be studied purely as a separate science. It has to borrow continually from economics, health, sociology, engineering, depending on the subject being administered.
So it loses its claim to a single self-contained body of knowledge and becomes a synthesizing field, a polyglot.
It's drawing on many specialized languages to understand the specific problem at hand.
Okay, so moving from content complexity to the question of who pays. The final key modern interpretation defines PA by its economic source, the market view.
Right. The market view defines PA by finance. It says PA deals with activities funded by taxpayers' money. Now, this definition appears deceptively simple, but it's solidified a profound modern paradigm shift away from the traditional state-centric view.
The traditional 19th and early 20th century view saw the state as all-powerful and the sole actor, right? If the government wanted a road built, the government hired government employees to build the road. End of story.
But that paradigm is fiscally and technically outdated. Modern PA recognizes that the state has inherent limits. It has fiscal constraints that require private efficiency, or it has technical constraints where it needs specialized expertise that only the private sector holds.
So to achieve massive public goals managing national infrastructure, IT systems, complex social service delivery, the state now has to partner with non-state actors.
And this shift is summarized perfectly by the PPP model, public-private partnerships. Since services are increasingly delivered by private or nonprofit entities but funded by the taxpayer, the definition of public administration has to expand to include those private actors.
Which fundamentally changes the definition of public.
It completely changed it. It moves it away from strictly government employees working in a government building to anyone involved in a taxpayer-funded service delivery chain.
Even if they clock in at a corporate headquarters.
Exactly. The old single-actor paradigm has shifted decisively to a multi-actor paradigm.
And this introduces a massive accountability challenge for the administrator, who is now tasked with managing outcomes from actors they don't directly control. The shift in meaning has directly inflated the scope.
Without a doubt. So we've established that the definition or the meaning of PA is constantly shifting. Logically, the scope, which asks, what are the boundaries of what this discipline studies? It must also be vacillating or unfixed.
This brings us right back to Dwight Waldo's fundamental concern. The very thing he said leads to mental paralysis. We need to fully unpack what he meant by that.
Waldo was observing a field that was tearing itself in two. On one side, you have the legacy of the classical school, demanding PA be a neutral, efficient, technical science. That's the managerial view.
And on the other?
On the other, you had the new public administration demanding PA be morally engaged, focused on social equity, and politically relevant. That's the integral view.
So the paralysis comes from the inability to synthesize these two opposing demands. The demand for technical efficiency versus the demand for democratic responsiveness and ethical action.
Exactly. That's the core of it. If you define PA as a neutral science, you risk becoming completely irrelevant to the major social issues of the day. But if you define PA as a purely political, value-driven enterprise, you risk losing the tools of efficiency and management expertise.
And trying to create a single, unified theory that does both.
That's the source of the paralysis.
Despite this difficulty, early scholars still tried to pin down the scope using these structural frameworks. They tried to list the components required for any government to operate.
Willoughby, for instance, he offered a really detailed list. He categorized the scope into key functional areas: overhead administration, organization, personnel, finance, and materials. He was trying to itemize every major structural requirement of government.
But the simpler mnemonics often stick better. McQueen's definition is one of the clearest attempts to simplify the resource base.
Yes, the 3Ns McQueen simplified the scope into the essential resources required: men, materials, and methods.
People, things, and processes.
Basically, it's a highly effective way to remember that administration is always about three things: managing the people, managing the physical resources, and managing the techniques or processes needed for action.
Other scholars tried to divide the scope based on the type of knowledge required.
Fifner, for example, he split the scope into principles: The tools and techniques like organization and finance and spheres, which were the levels of government involved, central, state, local.
Walker had a similar approach.
Very similar. He distinguished between the abstract administrative theory concepts and structure and applied administration, which is the actual real-world fields like public health or revenue collection. All these early efforts, they were trying to find a universal, stable structure. That was the intellectual trend of the era.
But the true conflict within scope, which mirrors the conflict in meaning, it revolved around who exactly is included in the subject matter. This is the managerial versus integral scope conflict.
The managerial view, which was strongly supported by scholars like Simon and Gulick of POSDCORB fame, argued that PA was limited only to managerial functions.
The intellectual work.
The intellectual work of administration. Planning, organizing, controlling, budgeting.
This is the high-level, bosses-only view. If you follow this, you're only studying the people at the top who manage things. The administrative activity of the clerk who files the papers or the manual laborer who fixes the road, they're excluded from the scope of study.
They saw administration as strictly directing and controlling a high-level science. Now contrast this with the integral view, championed by Fayol and L.D. White. They insisted that the scope includes all activities, managerial, technical, clerical, and manual.
So everyone, from the peon doing manual labor, if that labor is required to deliver the public service, all the way up to the secretary constitutes administration.
The road worker fixing the road is just as much a part of public administration as the urban planner who designed it.
The integral view seems clearly more realistic for service delivery.
It is, but the managerial view had academic clout because it aligned with the claim that PA was a scientific, universal management process applicable anywhere. But then, empirical research began to, well, undermine the managerial view.
So what shattered the faith in rigid technical processes? What forced the scope to break open?
The Hawthorne experiments. Conducted in the late 1920s and early 1930s, they were revolutionary. They showed definitively that organizational efficiency was not just a product of technical rules or lighting or rest periods.
It was about people.
It was about human behavior, motivation, and informal group dynamics. The feeling of being watched and recognized mattered far more than rigid universal techniques.
This is a massive shift. If human factors can override the rules, then the scope of PA can no longer exclude psychology, sociology, and social behavior.
It was the death knell for the purely technical focus of the POSDCOA model and the managerial view. It demonstrated that organizational reality is fundamentally social and psychological, not just a technical science.
Which inevitably leads back to the dominant scope today.
The subject matter view. Because organizational behavior and specific content knowledge are essential, the scope expanded functionally to include, as you said before, everything under the sun that the government touches.
So this necessary expansion of scope, absorbing so many ideas from sociology, economics, law, it led to a profound period of anxiety in the 1970s and 80s.
Oh, a huge one.
The crisis of identity. If PA borrowed everything, scholars started to fear it was losing its own unique anchor. If you become a field that simply applies the principles of economics to budgeting and sociology to personnel management, are you still a separate discipline?
That was the existential question. But this is where Dwight Waldo returns to defend the modern discipline. He argued that this polyglot, this multi-language mixed nature is not a weakness, but a profound strength.
Because PA's ability to synthesize knowledge from other fields, to speak the language of economics, health, and engineering, allows it to tackle complex, cross-cutting problems.
Like climate change or healthcare policy.
Things that are inherently interdisciplinary.
Precisely. Waldo insisted that despite the borrowing, the stable core of the subject remains the application. The application to governmental decision-making and service delivery, that anchor of government in action, is what gives PA its unique character and integrity, even if the analytical tools themselves are sourced elsewhere.
This functional approach means that the modern scope has to reflect the diverse responsibilities an administrator now holds. Stephen K. Bailey provided an excellent framework for the contemporary administrator, dividing the scope into 4 essential dimensions.
Right. First is the descriptive dimension. This is the necessary baseline, describing structure, hierarchy, legal mandates, the facts. The is of administration. How is the department actually organized?
Second, the normative dimension.
This moves beyond facts to the realm of values and ethics, what ought to be done. Because administrators exercise discretion and make choices affecting resource distribution, they are constantly engaged in making value judgments. This dimension recognizes the ethical responsibility of the public official.
Third, the assumptive dimension.
This dimension integrates the lessons of the Hawthorne experiments. It requires understanding how administrators actually behave in the field, their political motivations, their informal allegiances, their biases, versus how we assume they behave based on the rigid organizational charts.
And finally, the instrumentive dimension.
This is the practical side, integrating the best of the process view. It focuses on the functional tools and techniques like budgeting software, performance management, or human resource models used to efficiently reach specified goals. Bailey's framework is powerful because it integrates the political, the ethical, the behavioral, and the technical aspects into one coherent modern scope.
And beyond the administrator's required knowledge, another approach to defining this immense scope is Ridley's view. It focuses not on content or technique, but on who is involved, the stakeholders.
Right. Ridley defines scope by the required relationships. He identified 3 key groups whose interaction defines the field: academia, the researchers and teachers who theorize about administration,
Then practitioners.
the civil servants and officials who actually perform PA. And crucially, the third group is citizens.
The inclusion of citizens is key because it forces the discipline to acknowledge that PA is not a one-way delivery system. It requires informed public participation.
It's a two-way street. Citizens must be aware of their rights, they have to claim benefits from the state, and they have to hold administrators accountable.
The entire discussion of meaning and scope, it brings us back to this constant defining tension in PA today. The current reality is that citizens demand big government services,
They want healthcare, infrastructure maintenance, massive social safety nets.
which naturally swells the scope of PA to its maximum. However, simultaneously, there is a powerful countertrend driven by economic ideology.
Modern trends like neoliberalism and outsourcing are constantly pushing for a minimal state.
Deregulation, efficiency, limiting government interference. So, what does this all mean for the person trying to understand governance today? It sounds like the definition and scope of public administration are locked in this perpetual, essential conflict between maximum service provision and minimal government intervention.
And that constantly requires administrators to perform a very difficult balancing act.
That was an incredible exploration. I mean, it shows that trying to define the government's work is like trying to draw boundaries around a shifting landscape. We trace the definition from that narrow focus on just the executive branch all the way to the expansion of all 3 branches.
And finally, its explosion to include everyone involved in a public-private partnership, all bound together by taxpayer funding.
And we saw how that early confidence in universal tools like POSDCOR was just complicated by the reality of human behavior through experiments like Hawthorne. It forced the discipline to become a polyglot that has to pull from economics, sociology, and ethics just to get the job done.
But the core, as we said, remains fixed on that unique political application: government in action.
And we clarified that the famous mental paralysis is really the intellectual difficulty of reconciling the demand for administrative efficiency with the demand for social and political responsiveness.
That's the tension at the heart of it all.
Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us, clarifying the complex, crucial field of public administration.
My pleasure.
And now, a final provocative thought for you, the listener. Considering the constant tension between the demand for maximum governmental services and the ideological push for a minimal state, how will the scope of public administration change when artificial intelligence, which is neither a branch of government nor a traditional private partner, becomes the primary mechanism for the authoritative allocation of values in the next decade? What happens when the authoritative decisions about who gets what are made by an algorithm? Something to mull over.